Hello, Ohio gozaimasu, and I'm a little bit late to offer my lament for the passing of Shinoda Masahiro. I recently spent a long time preparing and writing a piece for the magazine Cineast all about the director's career, trying to restore something of his reputation, which is not quite as high, certainly in the West, as I believe it should be. He died just after the piece was published. So I'd been immersed in the life and work of this filmmaker for quite a long time and had just got out of that sort of phase of thinking and working and talking with others. And so I've found it a little bit difficult to come back to it to offer my thoughts here. But as I said in my piece, which was to coincide with the Criterion Collection's recent release of Shinoda's fantasy horror drama, Demon Pond, I think he is someone whose work should be celebrated. I think there are several very important facets to his career that we should bear in mind. And I think he is a genuinely important director. I think there is a lot to say about this filmmaker, and I'm going to work on other videos offering reviews and thoughts on specific features of his career. But here I just want to offer a few broad comments about this career and say something of why I think he is an important filmmaker. Shinoda was one of the key filmmakers of what became known as the Shochiku New Wave cinema. Japan experienced, concurrently with France, with its Nouvelle Vague, the work of Jean-Luc Godard and others, its own new wave cinema from 1959 to around the mid-1960s. Most of the key directors associated with the new wave began their careers and spent the first few years working at Shochiku Studios, which had hitherto been a fairly conservative outfit, one dedicated to a fairly limited number of genres, such as the so-called home drama. Ozu Yasujiro spent almost all his career at Shochiku, for instance. And the director Naruse Mikio made several films at this studio. In trying to move away from this conservatism and sort of generic foundation to their output, Shochiku in the late 1950s offered several young assistant directors the chance to make their debut films somewhat ahead of time, if you like. These were filmmakers who had not yet served a full apprenticeship, but who were showing a keen vision, a keen talent, and a keen individuality in rejecting the work and the ideology and the sensibility of their mentors, of people like Ozu, and who were keen to dive into cinema as a way of expressing something of their own feelings of disaffection with Japanese society in general, which was at this time in a very controversial state of adjusting to being a sort of Western style free market capitalist democratic nation after having been to a certain extent made over in the earlier 1950s because of the US occupation. There had been at this time a security pact developed between America and Japan. This was first ratified in 1950 and was coming up for renewal in 1960, so right around the time when the new wave was beginning. And disaffection over what this pact represented for Japan and its politics and society fed a lot of youthful, often student revolts, and riots were seen in the streets, for instance. So these directors, principally Oshima Nagisa, Yoshida Kiju, and Shinoda Masahiro, were given the chance to make films and in various ways worked to develop something of their feelings, their antagonistic feelings, their feelings of disaffection, and also to use form and narrative to new ends in Japanese cinema. The early work of Shinoda Masahiro at Shochiku is a little bit more conventional and less flamboyantly experimental and political than his peers, typically the two aforementioned colleagues, Oshima and Yoshida. Shinoda was given scripts to direct. He had far less of a hand in the material that he was presenting than did Oshima in films like Cruel Story of Youth or The Sun's Burial or Night and Fog in Japan, or did Yoshida in films like Good for Nothing or Blood is Dry or Escape from Japan. So it's perhaps for this reason that Shinoda's early work fostered a sense that he was a more conservative filmmaker, that he was less keen to push the envelope, if you like, and less interested in contemporary politics, particularly the politics of youthful antipathy and rebellion. I think this is not quite the case. It's certainly true that his early films are quite safe, in some ways quite conventional, although he did make very political films. The film Dry Lake features a young protagonist who fills his bedroom with posters of Hitler before going on to become a criminal. But he did make films such as One Way Ticket to Love, his feature debut, or Epitaph to My Love, that are quite conventional, that are quite safe ideologically, if you like. However, as I said, Shinoda was himself dissatisfied with these films. He incrementally, but certainly increasingly, became disillusioned with studio filmmaking. And by the 1960s, by the mid 1960s, he had managed to follow Oshima and Yoshida and leave Shochiku in order to set up his own independent production company. And it was with the first films that he made as his own independent producer, films like Pale Flower in 1964 or Double Suicide in 1968, that he made both his international reputation and really made his name as someone who could be classed as an anti-establishment, liberal, experimental filmmaker. Pale Flower reworks the then traditional Ninkyo Eiga Yakuza film to very interesting sort of psychological ends. And Double Suicide is a very experimental adaptation of a traditional bunraku puppet play, where the cinema itself is envisaged as a stage in which everything is self-reflexively given over to showing the mechanics of filmmaking, as this impacts on the story of two lovers who become social pariahs and are driven to the act of the title, Double Suicide. These are fascinating films, and Shinoda's work thereafter, throughout the latter half of the 1960s and the 1970s, is given over to quite diverse and different films, but always films that had at least one foot in genre cinema, in commercial cinema. This is not, to my mind, a negative. I think he was able to mark out a kind of liminal space between the commercial and the art cinema, or the non-commercial. And in films that he directed throughout these decades, even going throughout the 80s, where his work tends to become a little bit more safe and staid. He was able to use the climates of genre cinema in order to address contemporary concerns, in order to mark out material that is intended for mass consumption with, I don't want to say messages, but with details that rhyme interestingly with contemporary Japanese politics. Shinoda was outspoken about politics in a lot of ways, but he didn't make films that simply decried and sort of got on soapboxes about political points. He wanted to entertain an audience as much as perhaps educate them. And again, for this reason, I think perhaps his work has been unfairly neglected. As I said, I'm going to make some more videos about Shinoda because there's far more to say. I just wanted to say here something of why his work is important, why perhaps it's been overlooked, and why you should do all in your power to search out this work. The recent release of Demon Pond, which, whilst not his best film, is certainly a very, very interesting film in which Shinoda engages in quite a detailed exploration of the place of tradition in contemporary Japan, is certainly a film that would make a reasonable starting point for looking at Shinoda's career if you are entirely new there too. But really, any of his films are decent starting places. There is far more difference and diversity across his career than is true with Oshima, Yoshida, or indeed Imamura Shohei, the other key sort of luminary of the Japanese new wave cinema. So it doesn't really make a great deal of difference where you jump in to Shinoda's work. I think what is important is that you do. So if you've seen some of Shinoda's films, comment, get in touch, let me know what you think, let me know what your favourites are. Subscribe and like, or don't, and look out for some more Shinoda videos in the near future.